Hey, I'm Aaron. I'm an atheist.
And I'm Steven. I'm a Christian.
This is Out of the Echo,
where two brothers share one conversation about God, the Bible, and Christianity. And today we're going to be talking about morality, and specifically how an atheist views morality. Because, Aaron, I know part of your story with having been a part of the church and kind of identifying as an atheist even during that time, one of the reasons that you stopped attending church was because of this idea of morality, and specifically that Christians would talk about the fact that atheists couldn't ultimately have a sense of morality.
There is no God. If there is no God, there's nothing ultimately right or wrong.
So God makes better sense of morality than if there is no God. God makes better sense of human dignity than if there is no God.
The religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality.
Yeah, I found it really annoying when Christians would say that atheists can't really believe in an ultimate morality. But at the same time, I also agree. I don't really believe in an ultimate morality, but I don't like them saying it. So there's a sense that I don't believe that there is an ultimate morality, something that we absolutely strive for. But I think we can also have ultimate morality in certain decisions. So I can say some things are ultimately wrong and some things are ultimately good, which it sounds like a contradiction. Sam Harris, in his book, The Moral Landscape, he gives a great example. There's not an objective healthy food out there, but I can also say objectively that celery is better for you than poison. And so that's kind of where we get that concept. Also, we can look at morality in kind of a scientific way, that we can view how things affect people, how our decisions can either benefit humanity or be negative towards humanity. And that's kind of how we get some of our morality through that. So I think there's different levels of morality. There's like our societal level, kind of like how my family, my surroundings affect my morality. Then you also have like a government level where my laws come from. And then we have an ultimate societal of what's best for humanity, that kind of thing. So that's kind of how I view my morality as an atheist.
So that's really interesting. So what would you say is like the ultimate, is there like a grid that you think through when it comes to morality, and like what ultimate goals people should be looking for or aiming for? Or is it more of a case by case, like we kind of have a sense of what is good or what is bad? Yeah.
And I think for some reason, viewing morality through the mindset of like a health has been super helpful for me. That analogy that Sam Harris gave has been really beneficial. So if you Google like from 10 different people what health food you should be eating, you're probably going to get about 5 different things. Some of them are going to be close. People aren't going to recommend a candy diet. And so that's kind of, I guess, how I'm looking at it is we may not exactly know what exactly we're striving for, but typically we can agree on what we're not striving for. And so that's kind of how I view it. We can bicker about the little details, but for the most part, those health food people, they're marching towards the same direction, even though they can't exactly agree on the destination.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So what would you think is like the big picture kind of direction of morality? So like if it's health, we'd say like there's certain, BMI that you're trying to get to, or you're trying to do things that you can live longer. But when it comes to morality, like what would you say is like some of the big picture things that we would say directionally we can agree on?
Yeah. So for me, it'd probably be keeping humanity alive. That'd probably be what I think we should strive for. People might also tack on there to keep the animal life that we have, or to prevent animal suffrage. Not saying that's a bad thing, but typically what I'm viewing for is like keeping Homo sapiens alive.
Yeah. Okay. Just one note. You said animal suffrage. That would be the right for animals to vote, I think. I'm not in favor of that personally, because I've had plenty of pets, and I know that they happen to to believe differently than I do politically, but I just wanted to call that out.
No, my cat Chip, I'm taking him to the polls.
Major Democrat, Chip. So practically speaking, what are some of the questions that you mentioned that you've read Sam Harris's book, and you've obviously been thinking about this for a while. Practically speaking, what are some of the questions that kind of come into sharper focus when you think this way, or the questions that come to mind? Because a lot of times we think hypothetically, like we might go to the question of the Nazis, but what about what are some practical ethical questions that you kind of deal with and this has helped you to process better?
One interesting point, I think, is say like a man hitting on another man's wife, that kind of idea. A man flirting with another man's wife, just in case that got misconstrued. Why should I take offense if someone flirts with my wife? Ultimately, I have no right to this, yada, yada, yada. I think there's a sense that if my wife and I have an agreement that we're not going to get with other people, then we should uphold to that agreement. And if I or my wife don't uphold to that agreement, then there's going to be very natural ramifications. I can choose to get out. She could choose to get out. We don't have to stay together after that. So there's not like an ultimate consequence, but there is a very natural consequence to that.
Yeah, I hear you on natural consequences. I guess I'm wondering if you are thinking of it the other way of, you're the person who's being flirted with, who is in a marriage, then is there, you mentioned the natural consequence, but is there anything ultimate?
There is not an ultimate reason why a husband and a wife can't do something outside of the husband and wife. But if it's not agreed upon between the two, there will be a natural, ramification from it. But if it actually is agreed upon on both sides, well, then that's within the agreement. And so that is, there's nothing wrong with it.
Okay. Interesting. I wonder, I think you might even be able to make an argument societally that maybe it's better, to have people who actually keep their covenants and, their promises.
Oh, well, there is another health ramification that, you could end up with an STD or something like that. So there are things that can come from it, but yeah. And so are you kind of hinting at the fact that we tend to see kids flourish in a, one man, one woman kind of household? Is that kind of what you're hinting at?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, kids flourishing, people flourishing more from, not just from the health side of it, but just the stability that society is on balance better when people are faithful to their promises and to their spouses. So I'm even just looking from your perspective of thinking like, man, it feels like you could almost make a case for an oughtness to faithfulness,
And and that's actually kind of what Sam Harris is talking about. Like when we can actually measure things and say like, okay, this is beneficial, this is not beneficial, then we really should cut that out. And so, if we can really support the numbers on that, then I need to backtrack what I'm saying and say, then this is what we ought to be going towards.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. I think the next thing that I'd like to hear your perspective on is how this might apply to some of the bigger picture questions, because I think of two in particular and just want to hear you process how you think about those, and not necessarily the details of it, but like how you would think about it as an atheist trying to be a moral person. The first is global warming, climate change, and then the second is abortion.
I really struggle with the climate change just because I haven't been super wrapped up in it. And it's really interesting going from the Christian side, and they're all boo, like God's going to come back before that, so don't worry about it. That's what I was raised in, so that's kind of been my mindset. And now on this side, all the atheists are like, we got to panic. So Yeah, it's really hard to say. But yeah, typically the argument is like, there is a greater cause. So if I'm doing something knowing that it's harming the planet and therefore harming the kids of the future, for me to say something is immoral, then we kind of have to know for a fact, like, okay, this is causing a problem. And so then I think we could say, like, if I'm burning plastic and that definitely is, gonna warm the earth for future generations, then I messed up by doing that. So I think we can go that route. When it comes to abortion, there's a couple different thoughts. For me, I really hate the idea of someone being born into like a home that they're not wanted, or being born into a very difficult home and knowing that they're going to go through so much trauma through that, or if they're born with a health condition that's going to plague them for the rest of their lives. It's really hard to know that they're going to be born into that. There's also, this is going to sound heartless to talk about. Of course, I kind of feel like anytime you're pro-abortion, you're going to come across heartless. But there's a podcast, and they also had a little movie come out called Freakonomics. And one thing they talked about was crime rates in the 80s in New York went down pretty drastically. And so all these different people were trying to take credit for it. Giuliani was taking credit for it. The police chief was taking credit for it. All these different people are saying they caused it. But when you really look at the numbers, like, well, how? How could they have actually made that big of a difference in the crime rate? Well, one thing they talked about was, well, let's look at the numbers. And it was something like 18 years or 20 years before this crime decrease is when abortion was legalized. And so you can make the argument, well, what if all these kids weren't born into these impoverished homes and places that they're not wanted? And then that's what was bringing the crime rate down. So they're not saying, we can't ultimately say like, okay, this is what caused it. But they're looking at the numbers saying there is some correlation between the two. So is it actually better for society to not have these kids brought up in an area or in a home that they know is going to cause harm towards the kid?
Yeah, that's so just processing that, like that's kind of terrifying to me just to think about, because as someone who believes that life begins at conception, or at least way closer to conception than birth, to like that spells like the loss of life, like even the loss of crime. If we're to attribute that to a generation of children who were killed, then that's pretty terrifying to think about. Like, so how do you think about that as an atheist? Like, do you go like, well, life just begins at this point, or how do you even think about that side of like, what is human life versus potential human life?
Something I do want to add to that last statement is like, I do think they're onto something with that correlation, but that doesn't mean that like, then we have to be pro-abortion. Like, the other thing to do is put these kids in a place where they're not going to have the trauma, and
Right.
give them the better life in that way. So when does conception begin? There's a sense of, what's the difference between using protection versus an abortion? Like, ultimately they're doing the same thing, but there is a ickiness towards knowing that there's a heartbeat, knowing that there's a life. But ultimately, like, what's the parent trying to do? The parent's trying to not have a kid. But I almost feel like Catholics have it right by also saying that you shouldn't wear protection, because it is doing the same thing. Does that make sense? Like, that, making that correlation?
I wouldn't make that correlation, because I think there's a fundamental difference between stopping conception from happening and something that's happened and from my perspective, killing the child. So if we were to change the timelines and you were talking about a 2-year-old, then you wouldn't look at it the same as wearing a condom or taking a contraceptive pill. So like, would you say that like a married couple not having sex is the same as abortion. Like at some point you draw the line and you say like, well, these two things are not the same, even if you have the same goal in mind of I'm not ready to have a child.
Have you heard that Bill Burr sketch about abortion that he talked?
Yeah, the cake.
Yeah. Whenever he talks about like, if I make a cake and I put it in the oven and then someone grabs it and throws it across the room and you're like, hey, that was my cake. Like, no, it wasn't a cake. Well, it would have been. I get that.
If you didn't touch it. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a sense of like, no question about like, well, what happens if a married couple just doesn't have sex for a kid? Like, okay, so no, I agree with you. Like that is the other extreme, and that's not the same. We can agree on that.
Right.
But going back to like Bill Burr's analogy, like, okay, so in this case, the cake is in the oven, all the ingredients are together, and it's just baking. Well, what if I do the same thing with the ingredients and just throw them on the ground? Like, when do we make that distinction? And I guess that's what I'm saying. Like, Christians are really focusing on the cake in the oven, but you can spill the ingredients wherever you want, and that's fine. Like, well, like it almost feels like the same thing when you look at it that way.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to pull these things out because I do think that, like when we were talking about marriage, I could see from your argument where I might even say we can get to the same place using different like foundations. Sometimes that can be the case. Like, well, we can't just go around murdering each other, right? Or we can't just like, what if everybody just stole from the hotel? Mm-hmm. That doesn't work out. Like it messes it up for everybody. And I think you can apply that logic oftentimes, but when you get to questions, the really hard questions of morality, and a lot of this obviously gets into the political arena, which is not necessarily what we're all about, and trying to stay out of necessarily the specifics of creating policy, but just from a moral standpoint, would we say abortion is a good thing or a bad thing? And I think, societally, we usually want to say like, well, I think it's a bad thing, but I think you should have the right to do it. Like that's where I think the culture at least is moving, and it could move to where it's like, no, it's fine. It's no different than, killing an ant that, is in your house or whatever. But I think that those fringe topics that oftentimes get a lot of play on, Fox News or CNN.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
And it sounds a little silly to say like this is a good thing or a bad thing. Like no one's really saying abortion is good, but it might be like something that we use or something like that. I kind of like, even if you're for the death penalty, no one's saying the death penalty is good.
I think part of it is it exposes, these are things that expose like our brokenness. Like even if we say abortion, and I'm obviously not pro-abortion, but if I were, then I'd probably want to avoid saying it's a good thing, because if nothing else, it's like abortion 100% of the time happens in bad situations, where a person is like, man, this is a huge life decision, and I think that I'm going to go this way with it. Obviously, there are people who are on the fringe left who would say, no, it's absolutely a good thing, is no different, that kind of thing. But I think most people are in the place where like that is a bad thing, or it's at least it exposes a bad situation. And in the case of the death penalty, like there's all kinds of complications with that as well. You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. So,
there's a sense that given enough time, pro-life will be the majority agreement, because if everyone that's pro-abortion is killing off their offspring, eventually the pro-lifers are gonna outnumber them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I've thought of that as well. That it is almost a self-defeating policy.
Yeah,
because the people who are most likely to vote a certain way are the same ones who are being aborted. So to me, that's still sad. Like even just, when you talk about crime dropping because of this, it's just like, oh man, like that feels like the killing of a people and not just like a person. Mm-hmm. It's like when people say that Down syndrome is there's way fewer people with Down syndrome today than by percentage than in the past. It's like, oh man, you just think about like, why is that? And is that possibly because of abortion? It's kind of a sad direction that I took the conversation. Sorry.
Well, so going back to what I was saying, like what's the outcome we're looking for, and it's for, like, to lessen the suffrage of humanity, or whatever we want to say that endpoint is. How does abortion fit into that? And it does seem a little counterintuitive to say, like, we're going to kill off babies and that's good for humanity. I get that that's a little off-putting, but I guess what I'm looking for is, like, what's actually better for the person. If I know that this person's going to have a damaged life, but in the future, if we have ways to counteract these things and just give the kid a better life, that's far better. Like, of course we should go that route versus abortion. And I guess that's where I'm coming from. Like, I think right now abortion is, I hate to say good, but I think we can make an moral argument for it. But I hope in the future that we can actually lessen that moral argument and have a better solution.
Yeah, one thing I really appreciate about what you're saying is, like, when you get out of the echo chamber of the political conversation, like, you've never once said this is about a woman's right to choose. And so you're not, like, just repeating the same arguments that are out there, but trying to really engage with the argument at a moral, like, the moral question that is at the root of this. And I really appreciate that. The last question that I have, at least right now, is, I guess, about asking the questions. Like, when it comes to, like, when I think of this almost like a scientific study, morality, like, who are the people who should be whether it's in charge or that we should be looking to ask the right questions to get us to those moral answers from your worldview?
Ooh, great question. It's really tough because I feel like so much of our science today is fueled by companies. I don't know exactly who to say, because I'm not the type of person that's going to implicitly trust the government. I'm not going to just implicitly trust anyone. So in some ways, I think it's kind of like one of those time will tell kind of things. So there was science that said smoking was good for us for the longest time. And I'm sure that there were people that knew, like, hey, this is causing problems. But then there were also doctors recommend this brand. So, but over enough time, there was enough that just couldn't be ignored. And so I guess that's what I'm kind of hoping for, that even what we're talking about with abortion, there's going to be people on both sides that are going to reject a notion no matter how much logic or numbers we throw at them. They're going to just stand behind their argument. But I think we do need to have kind of an open mind and think, what is actually the best solution, and hopefully head towards that.
Yeah, for sure. Like, when we're able to see something and, like, this is a bad thing or this is a good that we should be striving for together, can we at least link arms toward that?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'll just say, like, you really touched on the point that's kind of been ringing in my mind as I'm hearing you, which is that it feels like in order for us to ask the right questions, we almost need, like, moral people asking the questions. And oftentimes the people who are funding the asking of the question have an agenda. And at least in our society, in our culture, it's like, how do you even devote the right amount of time to coming to a place where you've really studied this well and objectively? And it's so hard because you are up against, like, whoever stands to make a dollar on something. Like, you just hope that the dollar is on the right side of morality.
Yeah, man.
Whereas at least the comfort for me as a Christian is, like, yeah, I may have a different perspective on things. Like, we Christians change their views on moral things, and hopefully it's because they've looked to the Bible and they've been refined in their thinking. But at least there's some sense of objectivity there that is at least hope-filling, even if you look around and you go, well, the world is certainly not going in the direction of what I'm hoping for. But at least I feel like I know what true north is. And that's just, like, my fear in this conversation. What makes me kind of antsy is, like, it feels like true north is, like, up for debate when it comes to atheism.
There's been so many times that I've gone into a situation and I've looked through the situation through the caricature that I had been indoctrinated with or I've been taught.
Mhm.
So how much of that do you feel like is an actual legitimate fear versus like this is just, I hate to say you're indoctrinated, but something that, Christians like to talk about, like, atheists can't have morals. Hopefully, maybe I'm an example that you can still have someone that's kind of moral, even on the atheist side. Like, do you feel like this is something that maybe through our interactions has been helpful and maybe like diminish that fear? Or do you think you still kind of have that ultimate fear about it?
It's a great question. The big picture of our culture, there's a fear that whether a person is a self-proclaimed atheist or not, that a lot of people functionally are probably more in that thinking, even if they consider themselves Christians or whatever. And so it feels like, it's in the Bible and in Judges, it talks about everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And that in the book of Judges is not a good thing. Like it creates this cycle of like bad stuff happening and the people not doing the right things in the society, just like spiraling down and down and down. And so I wouldn't even, I say fear, I think it's more just like a concern toward the culture and the direction, and like a sadness toward like, man, I wish that people, like, it just feels so different to see people living in ways that feel destructive toward them and toward the society at large. I think for a person, so taking you, for example, I think of you generally as a moral person. So it's not like I'm like, well, he's an atheist, therefore he's going to go around killing people. I think at an individual level, so like I think of you generally as a moral person. Like I know obviously how you were brought up and tend to know how you think, though maybe it's different, because we're not around each other nearly as much as we used to be. But I kind of think of it this way, like in the Garden of Eden, Adam takes of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, and it's kind of like, well, that's the big sin that like put us, into this place, like is a piece of fruit, really? And what I think it comes down to is that, like, are you going to get wisdom through your own means, or are you going to see wisdom as like following the instructions of your creator, who has told you like, this is what is good for you, this is what is right? And so I think for any person, especially for you, just thinking in terms of morality, I guess I don't necessarily worry that, I certainly don't worry that you're going to go out and kill someone, but I just worry that, like, man, like, is this the best that you can have? Like, is a morality that is based on like humanity and us hopefully asking the right questions, like, is that best for you?
Yeah, there's a sense that we're never going to have the same true north. They're going to coincide at times for sure. But yeah, if you're saying like your true north is seeking God, then yeah, we're going to be all over the place. And if that's the case.
So for my last question, I guess, how do you view like looking back into history? And, because I think I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times these questions come to the Holocaust or slavery or different things like that. But with your framework, is that possible, given that our knowledge of things kind of progresses? Are you able to look back into history and say that something was right or wrong from an objective perspective?
Right, yeah, because if we're viewing the past actions through our objective and what we're striving towards, and we look at those past actions and we can say, no, okay, those don't align with what we're going towards. But it's also, we can chalk it up to they don't have the same understanding that we do today. And obviously they were in a different culture and whatnot. So if we go back to health, there were doctors promoting cigarettes as healthy. They were using asbestos as insulation. But like today, if I were to use asbestos as insulation, I would be immoral because, I'm killing my family. So there is a sense of like they didn't have the understanding, but they were brought up and indoctrinated in a time period that was different than ours. So I don't want to say that they were making right decisions because of their upbringing and whatnot. We can still look back and say, no, they were wrong, but we can understand why they made those wrong decisions because of the information that they were being fed. And I guess that's where I want to look at it, is I want to understand them as a person, but I can also, based on what I know, say they made the wrong decision. Does that make sense in that distinction?
Yeah, that's interesting. So that actually brought another question to mind. Do you think that you can look back and find that we were at some point more moral? So like, do you feel like morality, like in history, sort of a progressivist idea of like we're getting more moral, or do you feel like it can be cyclical, or like how do you view history?
That's an interesting question. I feel like that's so hard to answer, because typically when morals are brought up in past, it's like the Colosseum. Like it's typically horrible stuff. Like I can't think
right.
of
the things that made history.
Yeah, I can't think of a history book that's like, these people, they had it right. You know?
Sorry, I was gonna give maybe more color to the question. And where that question comes from is actually, there's this quote from C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to butcher it, but he wrote in actually a foreword to a really old book. He wrote that we should always read old books, like we should read books outside of our own century. And he basically said the reason is because you have your own blind spots in your day and in your culture, and that if we could read future books from 100, 200 years in the future, that would be fine. But we don't have access to the future. So we have to look to the past instead. And I found that to be a really helpful framework of looking at the past as like also flawed people, but with different blind spots. But I'm curious, like if I was coming from your framework, I just wonder how I would think about it.
I think, okay, so given more time to think about this, probably like the Native American Indian culture, they had a really interesting idea. Like they really loved the land that they had. They took care of it. Like they seem like they probably had it right. They were
So I guess you're saying, like, though not a lot of examples come to mind, there are probably ways that we could look back and say those people had something that I could have learned from.
Right. Yes.
Even if there were things that from a scientific perspective, we would say like, well, you were doing this wrong and this wrong and this wrong. But they could look at us and be like, so you stare at these little rectangles all day? Like, how's that moral?
Right. We're even talking about like global warming, and obviously they didn't contribute to global warming at all. You know, like, it's not like they had cars back in the day before we took their land. The sense of like they truly cared about their land, which also in turn kept them alive. So they had this reciprocal like love for what's also keeping them. So I guess that's when I'm looking towards like that seem like, based on what I'm talking about, of keeping humans alive, even, you know, limiting animal suffrage and all that, like that seems to summarize what I'm talking about. I'm also really stupid when it comes to history, so that's the only thing I can think of. I'm sure there's much better examples.
Yeah, but I get it. I get what you're saying, and that's helpful.
I don't know. I really like this talk. Like, I got on the defense. I really didn't want to turn the tables and say like, oh, well, you can't say this. You can't. You know, you're going to get your turn eventually. But I wanted this to really just kind of focus on the atheist side of it.
Yeah, thanks for taking the hot seat today, and for opening up a little view into your thinking.
Cool. Yeah, I enjoyed this talk.